you. Yeah, covenant theology in 30 minutes or less. Thank you. For the next little while, I want to think together with you about the idea of covenant as the foundation of a renewed community. And I'd like to begin that thinking with a little story. Many years ago, when I was a homemaker and our 3 children were small, they didn't like the idea of me leaving all that well. But of course, there were times when I needed, or in fact wanted, to leave. And at those times, the kids would put up just a bit of a fuss, but none more so than our middle son, Peter. For whatever reason, when I was about to leave, Peter would actually cling to me like a spider web. Let's see if we can move that on. I would try to extract myself, but to no avail. Maybe some of you who are parents here know what that looks like, right? You're about to leave, and they grab around somewhere in this area, and you can't move very far. So you gently bend down and try to peel an arm off, but then the legs come around, and you are trapped, right? So generally what would happen is my husband would peel Peter off of me as I would make a quick exit out the door. All those times, I would promise Peter that I would be home soon. I showed him on the clock when I would be home. Nothing I said seemed to ease his anxiety, and while I would often be frustrated, I also felt very badly that he was so distressed. So one of those times, I came up with an idea. I reminded Peter of my promise to return and let him know that every time before I had returned. And then I took a square of paper, a lot like this. I sprayed it with my perfume. I pressed it to my lips so that it left a print of my lipstick on the paper, and I gave it to him, reiterating my promise to return. I told him this paper was a kiss and a hug from Mommy, and that when he missed me, he should pull it out of his pocket and remind himself of my kiss and my hug, and my promise to return. This piece of paper functioned as a reminder to Peter of my promise to return, and in some ways formalized that promise. In a way, covenants are like that piece of paper. They formalize a promise, and in the case of the biblical covenants, they guarantee and remind God's people of his promised blessings. Covenant is a word that crops up in Scripture numerous times. At least one count in the Hebrew root of that word shows up at least 264 times in the Protestant Old Testament. It might be helpful to know that much of what we know about covenants comes from our more general understanding of how covenants functioned as royal administrative instruments in the ancient Near East. Covenants were how kings in the ancient Near East managed or administered their kingdoms, much like laws are used by governments today to manage cities, states, or countries. Covenants were very often between a very powerful ruler and that ruler's subjects or servants. So let's unpack this just a little bit more. Looks like I don't have to click as many times as I hoped because it's all up there already. Perhaps the first thing that we need to note with regard to covenants is that they are generally a formal response to a relationship that is under some amount of stress. In other words, covenants do not establish a relationship. Rather, covenants formalize an already existing relationship, in some sense officially binding two parties together. So think about my son again for just a minute. We clearly had a relationship, nothing needed to be established there, but the relationship had some amount of a problem, at least in his mind. That little square of paper formally signified to him that I would be faithful to my promise, while at the same time reminding him to trust me. It secured our relationship beyond my simple promise, something like signing a contract. The second thing to note about covenants is that they come with oaths. In fact, some covenants that we're going to look at this morning come with a specific sort of oath called a self-maledictory oath. This oath is something like a child who says, "Cross my heart and hope to die." While she may not realize it, what she is essentially saying is that if I am not true to my promise, my life is your life. Or to put it slightly differently, it is to say, on pain of death, I will do as I have promised. The third thing to recognize is that covenants come with blessings and curses. Blessings for obedience to the stipulations or obligations of the covenant. Curses for disobedience. Now, we're actually going to be focusing almost entirely on blessings this morning, but I want you to keep that idea of covenant curses in mind as well. The fourth thing to recognize is that covenants come with signs. In the case of my story about Peter, the square of paper not only formalized a relationship, but it also functioned as a sign to him of that formalized relationship. So just to review, covenants are royal administrative instruments that secure an existing relationship and that come with oaths, blessings and curses, and signs. With that background in mind, then, I would like to look at several of the most important of the biblical covenants. Maybe. Here we go. If you have access to a Bible this morning, you may want to keep it handy. It's up to you. I will be referring to it throughout the presentation. There are 7 major explicit covenants in the Old Testament, and you see them up there on the PowerPoint slide. The covenants I want to deal with today are the ones that are the most directly related to salvation. That is, I'll see if it works. No, it just took them all away. Go back. We're going to look specifically at Abram 1, Abram 2, Sinai, and the New Covenant. One important feature of the biblical covenants that may not be immediately apparent, in some of them at least, is their communal nature. In every case, although God was sometimes speaking with only one person, the covenant was applied well beyond that one person to the person's descendants in perpetuity. Now, you'll find that to be especially true with Abram 1 and Abram 2 as we look at those. Once we get to the other two, God's actually speaking to a whole community. In other words, each covenant is really, I'll see if I can get to the right slide here, is really about how one particular community is blessed by God to give the world a glimpse of God's kingdom and to bring the blessings of God's kingdom out to the world. So we're going to begin by looking at God's relationship with Abram. I want to start with just a little background here. In Genesis 11, before Abram, we hear the story that we usually refer to as the Tower of Babel. The post-flood people on the plain of Shinar are striving to make themselves great. They aim actually to achieve God's creational blessing of fruitfulness and dominion on their own terms. And they intend, the text says, to make a name for themselves through city building. The result of their striving for self-fulfillment is to be scattered by God, the implicit message being human effort alone will not result in blessing. It is into this post-Babel context that we meet Abram. In Genesis 12, God comes to Abram with this very simple command: follow me. God says to Abram, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. In addition, God promises to give the land of Canaan to Abram's descendants. Unlike the people of Babel, God will make a great nation out of Abram, and God will bless him. God will make Abram's name great. The creational blessing of fruitfulness and dominion is a gift. It cannot be achieved. That gift is not to be held on to, however. God says that through Abram, all nations will be blessed. God's intention for blessing creation will come through this particular community, Abram and his descendants. God will bless this community not for personal fame, but for the very purpose of blessing others. God's blessing always implies the task of spreading that blessing around. One thing to note in Genesis 12 is that there's no covenant here yet. There is only a promise, land and descendants for the purpose of blessing the world. So if we circle back to that story I told about Peter at the beginning, right now Abram is like Peter without that piece of paper. Each of the following covenants are actually means to formalize this initial promise to Abram to bless him for the purpose of blessing others. So just a few years later, and a few chapters later in Genesis 15, Abram begins to have questions about this promise God has given him. Abram has been promised descendants, but he remains childless, and he's not getting any younger. So Abram says to God, "What can you give me since I remain childless?" Now that's a reasonable question, isn't it? Think about the promise again. If he's promised that he'll be a great nation, how would that happen with no children? The descendants are supposed to inherit the land, but there's no descendants. So what does he do? God responds graciously to Abram, "Look up at the stars. So shall your descendants be." But Abram has also been promised land. It is true that Abram believes the Lord with respect to descendants, and actually the text says that it is credited to him, or he is identified as righteous. So he kind of takes God's first answer, but then has another question. How can I know I will receive this land? God responds this time with a covenant, an unconditional divine pledge to Abram to secure God's promise of land to righteous Abram and to his descendants. The covenant is sealed by God with a self-maledictory oath. The sign of this self-maledictory oath is actually a path of blood from sacrificed animals through which God himself will pass in the form of a burning pot. In essence, by walking through this path, God says to Abram, "I swear on my own life that you and your descendants after you will surely receive the promised blessing. Cross my heart and hope to die." The covenant, like the promise it secures, is with a particular group of people, Abram and his descendants, insofar as his descendants continue to serve God like righteous Abram. And just like that original promise, it has as its key purpose blessing the world. So skip forward just a few chapters and a few more years to Genesis 17. Once again, God comes to Abram, but in the intervening chapters, it's important to know that Abram has once again doubted God's promised blessing. So you see the tension in the relationship. Abram had actually assented to his wife Sarai's suggestion that Abram use the servant woman Hagar as a means to have a child, since Sarai had not yet produced the promised heir. In essence, Sarai and Abram here are trying to fulfill the promised blessing of fruitfulness and dominion on their own terms, very much like the people of Babel. God responds by calling Abram once again to walk before me and be blameless. Given what has happened with Hagar, we should understand this as a call for recommitment to righteousness and a renewal of their relationship. God formalizes this recommitment with a covenant, this time with explicit instructions for Abram. God says, "As for me, this is what I'm going to do for you. I will make you the father of many nations." God affirms this part of the promise further by changing Abram's name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of nations. God says, "You will be fruitful. Nations and kings will come from you." Do you hear the creational blessings of fruitfulness and dominion just in those first two promises? Nations and kings, you will be very fruitful. God goes on, "I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant to be your God and the God of your descendants. I will give you and your descendants the land of Canaan." You can probably hear that this covenant reiterates and expands the promises made to Abram. But because of human weakness, this covenant will require an ongoing human response. So God says to Abram, "As for you, here's what you have to do: circumcision." The sign of circumcision functions as a visible reminder of Abram's relationship with God and the obligation of Abram and his descendants to walk before me and be blameless. Abram and his descendants are now oath-bound by the covenant to serve God. The permanent marking of the body through circumcision signifies the eternal nature of the covenant, but the sign also functions as a warning. To break one's covenant obligations is to be cut off from God and his people. Because this covenant is an expansion of the original promise to Abram, it is clear that the covenant blessings continue to be for the purpose of blessing others. So let's jump forward a few hundred more years to Sinai. Abram's descendants, Israel, has arrived at Sinai after the Exodus from Egypt. The promised blessing is in fact now partially fulfilled. Abram's descendants are now numerous, and they are on their way to the promised land of Canaan. Here in the desert, before entering the land of Canaan and taking possession of it, Israel is asked by God to recommit themselves on oath to be God's loyal servants. The covenant at Sinai, in other words, is a further ratification of the original Abrahamic promise and stands in continuity with it. The Sinai covenant is an oath-bound pledge that mirrors the pledge of faithfulness to the covenant symbolized in circumcision. The tablets of stone are a sign of God's ongoing covenant with Abraham's descendants. They remind his descendants, the nation of Israel now, of God's ongoing love for them and their obligations to serve him for the purpose of serving the world. The stipulations of the Sinai covenant, the law, offer the community instruction for living into the order of God's kingdom. Sinai tells Israel, this is what kingdom people look like. If they are faithful to these covenant stipulations, they will offer a glimpse of God's kingdom to the world while simultaneously conveying the kingdom blessings to those who they encounter. So, at this point, we might ask, what does it look like to be a community that offers a glimpse of God's kingdom to the world and uses God's blessing to bless others? While it is a bit difficult to find examples of a community as a whole blessing others, particularly in the Old Testament, the biblical book of Ruth actually offers an example of one person in the covenant community who exemplifies kingdom living, using God's blessing to bless the world. The book of Ruth opens with these words. So there's a little background. In the days when the judges judged. If you wanted to play some dark and scary music behind that, that's what that implies. From an Israelite perspective, the author might just as well have said in the days of turmoil and unrest in Israel. The background here is that Israel, Abram's descendants, have now received the promised land. The conquest of Canaan is over, and the generation that received the land from God through the conquest has died. According to the book of Judges, the children of that conquest generation knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. These children were now living in the land and had begun worshiping the gods of the land instead of the God of Abraham. The stipulations of Sinai were in fact seemingly forgotten. As the book of Judges says, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It is in this context that the book of Ruth takes place. There is a famine in the land of Israel, and one family moves to Moab to try to find food. This move to Moab is a move to enemy territory. While in Moab, the sons marry Moabite women, the father dies, and after some time, the sons die too. The mother, Naomi, is left with her 2 daughters-in-law. To be a widow at that time is to be desperate, lacking all support and protection. Naomi's family is in fact here as destitute as they can possibly be. But all is not lost. Sometime later, Naomi hears there is food in Israel again, so she packs her bags and, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, heads back to Bethlehem, her hometown. At a certain point, however, she stops, and she tells her daughters-in-law that they should not go any further. They should return to their families in Moab, who are going to be likely better able to provide for them than Naomi ever will. One of them chooses, tearfully, to return to her family in Moab. The other, Ruth, begs Naomi to be allowed to accompany her to Bethlehem. Naomi warns Ruth of her situation, but eventually agrees to let Ruth come with her to Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Now, it might be helpful at this point to point out that throughout this story, Ruth is referred to as the Moabite. Now think about this for just a minute to put it in perspective. The phrase throughout the book of Ruth, Naomi was accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, would have sounded to Israelite ears a lot like Naomi was accompanied by Ruth the terrorist would sound to our ears. Moab was a bitter enemy of Israel and not to be trusted. So Naomi and Ruth the Moabite arrive in Bethlehem. It is harvest time. As a widow and an alien, Ruth the Moabite is so far down the social ladder she can't see the midpoint, let alone the top. But she sees an opportunity to pick up the leftovers of the harvest in the field of a man named Boaz. Israelite law, part of the Sinai covenant, actually requires that the poor and foreigner be allowed to do this. Boaz recognizes Ruth as the Moabite daughter-in-law of Naomi, and as a response, makes special provision for her to gather in his field safely. He actually shows kindness to Ruth above and beyond what Israelite law would require. And he does this for an untrustworthy Moabite, an enemy. Throughout this little story, Boaz is held out as an exemplar of a righteous Israelite, a covenant keeper, In the midst of the chaos and disobedience of the era of the judges, Boaz exemplifies righteousness, eventually even compromising his estate for the sake of this foreigner. Boaz does not keep the covenant blessings for himself and his family. Rather, as God intended, Boaz uses these covenant blessings to bless those around him, even an untrustworthy Moabite. He blesses this Moabite, and in a sense there then is blessing the world, but the world turns out to be more than one single Moabite widow. The bigger story here that you see reflected on the sign is that Ruth turns out to be the great-grandmother of King David, the great king from Israel, from whom comes the only truly righteous Israelite, Jesus Christ, the one who perfectly obeys all of the stipulations of the covenant and introduces the new covenant, which is spoken about by the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah writes to Judah just prior to the imposition of the covenant curse of exile from the land for their disobedience. Jeremiah says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." The new covenant is a new administration of God's covenants with Abraham, which were renewed and strengthened at Sinai. God establishes an everlasting covenant with Abraham to be a God to you and to your descendants after you. At Sinai, Israel is reminded of this when God says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." With the new covenant, God once again says, "I will be your God, and you will be my people." The law given at Sinai was God's gracious second edition of the creation order. To live according to these instructions was to live as God originally intended and to benefit from his blessing. That instruction, however, will no longer be written on tablets of stone. God himself will now write it on the hearts of his people. The law will become a part of them so that they will be able to live as God intended, reflecting God's purposes for creation to the world. This new covenant both overrides and consummates the old through Jesus Christ. Jesus' righteousness supersedes that of Abram, of Boaz, and even of David through his fulfillment of the law and his sacrifice. The teaching of Sinai to love your neighbor becomes on Jesus' lips, love your enemy, just in case you didn't know who your neighbor was. The sign of this new covenant is Christ's own sacrifice, signified for us in the Lord's Supper. At the Last Supper, with his disciples, as Jesus passes the cup, he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." As we take the bread and the wine, signifying Christ's body and blood, the ultimate covenant sacrifice, we are united with Christ in his death and in his resurrection and in his covenant-keeping righteousness. In union with Christ, as beneficiaries of the covenant blessings, We are challenged, both as individuals and as a community, to recognize that blessing cannot be self-constructed as the Babel people tried to do. Blessing is a gift bestowed on us by God for the purpose of blessing others. And we are challenged to remember that we are not our own. We belong to Christ. And to belong to Christ is to belong to his body of covenant people. So my story is not only my story, but our story. And we are challenged to risk loving untrustworthy people, just as God has loved untrustworthy people like us. The blessing of God that is given to his covenant people must always flow outward into the communities God has placed us. As the blessings of the covenant flow outward from God's people into our homes, our neighborhoods, and our places of work, we become that little square of paper with perfume and a kiss that I gave to Peter. We in fact become the aroma of Christ, the hug and the kiss from God that our world so badly needs. Thank you.